Every day holds a story. Let's rewind. This is Today Rewound. Picture this. You're a 43-year-old Virginia planter who hasn't worn a military uniform in 20 years. You've been living the comfortable life of a gentleman farmer, managing your estates, attending fancy dinners in Williamsburg. Then suddenly, you're handed command of an army that doesn't exist, tasked with fighting the most powerful military force on Earth. This was George Washington's reality on June 15, 1775, and it would change the course of human history. But here's what they don't teach you in school. Washington was visibly uneasy about taking command. When John Adams nominated him to lead this imaginary army, Washington later wrote to his wife Martha that he felt like he was walking into an ocean of difficulties. The man we revere as the father of our military was genuinely terrified of the responsibility, and he had every right to be, because in the summer of 1775, independence wasn't even a formal goal yet. Most delegates still hoped for reconciliation with the Crown. The Continental Congress wasn't just appointing a general, they were conjuring an army out of thin air to fight a war they weren't even sure they wanted. There were no soldiers to command, no uniforms to wear, no weapons to stockpile, and no money to pay for any of it. They were essentially asking Washington to defeat the British Empire with hopes, dreams, and whatever muskets the colonists could scrounge up from their barns. Think about it. This was like giving command of NATO to someone with no formal army, no funding, and no chain of command. The British Army, meanwhile, was a well-oiled killing machine. They had conquered most of the known world, from India to the Caribbean. Their soldiers were professional, disciplined, and backed by the Royal Navy, the undisputed ruler of the seas. British officers looked at these colonial rebels the same way you might look at your neighbor's kids playing army in the backyard. Amusing, but hardly threatening. So how did a ragtag collection of farmers, shopkeepers, and teenagers manage to birth what would become the foundation of American military power? The answer lies in a story of transformation. Ordinary people forged into something extraordinary through shared hardship, brilliant leadership, and sheer determination to survive. Let's travel back to that humid Philadelphia summer of 1775. Picture yourself in that sweltering room where the fate of a continent hung in the balance. These men were still technically British subjects, about to commit the ultimate act of treason. And they knew it. If they failed, they would all hang. John Adams, short, fiery, and always thinking 5 moves ahead, had a problem. His home colony of Massachusetts was under siege. British forces had occupied Boston after the Tea Party, and local militias were desperately trying to hold them back. But Adams realized something crucial. If Massachusetts fought alone, it would look like a regional rebellion. The British could crush it and move on, but if all 13 colonies united behind a single Continental Army, it would become something far more dangerous, a revolution. So Adams hatched a plan that was part political genius, part desperate gamble. He would nominate a Virginian to lead New England's fight. Why? Because Virginia was the largest, wealthiest colony. If Virginia's favorite son was commanding Massachusetts troops, it would signal that this wasn't just Boston's problem, but America's problem. Then Adams looked across the room and saw him, George Washington, sitting quietly, wearing his old military uniform from the French and Indian War. It was a calculated fashion choice. Washington was the only delegate who showed up to Congress dressed like a soldier. He was sending a message without saying a word. Though Washington had limited success in his earlier military service, his leadership under fire and his stature as a Virginian made him a politically strategic choice. When Adams made the nomination, the room fell silent. Some believed John Hancock, the wealthy Massachusetts merchant and Congress president, had hoped to be considered. But Adams had a broader strategy in mind. The Congress voted unanimously. George Washington was now the general of an army that existed only on paper. Within days, Washington was riding north to Boston to take command. But imagine what he found when he arrived, a scene that would have broken lesser men. His Continental Army was actually a collection of separate militias from different colonies who couldn't stand each other. The New Hampshire men thought the Massachusetts men were arrogant. The Connecticut troops looked down on everyone else. They spoke different dialects, followed different customs, and had competing loyalties. Picture standing on the hills outside Boston, looking down at this patchwork of confused men with no uniforms. You literally couldn't tell who was on which side. Many soldiers showed up wearing whatever clothes they owned, carrying hunting rifles that couldn't mount bayonets. Some didn't even have shoes. In winter, you could track the Continental Army by following the bloody footprints in the snow. They had no military protocol. Soldiers would argue with officers, come and go as they pleased, and desert whenever they got homesick. One British observer mockingly wrote that the American army looked like a gathering of armed citizens rather than soldiers. And the money? There wasn't any. Congress had no power to tax, so they printed paper money that became increasingly worthless. Soldiers often went months without pay. The phrase, "not worth a continental," became slang for something completely worthless, and it came from the Continental Army's paper currency. But here's where our story takes an incredible turn. Washington realized that he wasn't just building an army, but forging the very idea of America itself. Think about the impossibility of his task. These men came from 13 separate colonies that had been rivals for over a century. Virginia tobacco planters had nothing in common with Massachusetts fishermen. Pennsylvania Quakers shared no culture with South Carolina rice farmers. The only thing that united them was their growing resentment of British rule. Washington's genius wasn't in military tactics but in psychology. He took men who saw themselves as Virginians or New Yorkers and slowly, painfully transformed them into something new, Americans. He created shared rituals, common symbols, unified standards. He banned gambling, swearing, and drinking to excess. He insisted on military courtesy and discipline. Gradually, these disparate groups began to see themselves as Continental soldiers. But the transformation nearly collapsed during that brutal winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge. Imagine the scene: men huddled around dying fires, wrapping their feet in rags, leaving bloody trails in the snow. They were starving, freezing, and surrounded by despair. Some units suffered staggering losses to disease and exposure. By winter's end, over 2,000 had died out of 12,000 men. Then came help from an unexpected source, a Prussian drill master named Baron von Steuben, who turned chaos into cohesion. This foreign volunteer taught Washington's amateur soldiers how to march, how to fight as units, how to move like a real army. Alongside him came young idealists like the Marquis de Lafayette, bringing European military expertise and international credibility to the American cause. Something remarkable happened in that frozen hell of Valley Forge. The men who survived began to see themselves as more than just colonial militias. They were survivors. They were brothers. They were Americans. And here's the most incredible part. They were amateur soldiers who learned to fight by fighting. Most had never seen a bayonet charge before facing the British. They learned military tactics through trial and deadly error. Yet somehow, this improvised force managed to outlast the greatest military power on Earth. The Continental Army fought for 8 grueling years. 8 years of defeats, retreats, and desperate survival. They lost more battles than they won. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and outfinanced. But they had something the British couldn't understand. They were fighting for an idea that didn't exist yet: the United States of America. British officers had scoffed at these amateur soldiers, but a year later, these same amateurs stood toe-to-toe with redcoats at Trenton and Princeton. By Saratoga in 1777, they had proven they could defeat professional European armies. By Yorktown in 1781, they had forced the British Empire to concede American independence, an outcome that shocked the world. But perhaps most remarkably, when the war ended, Washington did something that stunned even his enemies. He gave up power. King George III himself said that if Washington truly resigned his command and returned to his farm, he would be the greatest man in the world. And he did exactly that. The man who could have been America's first king chose instead to be its first citizen. From 1775 to 1783, Washington and his Continental soldiers had accomplished the impossible. They had transformed 13 squabbling colonies into a unified nation. They had proven that citizen soldiers could defend democratic ideals. They had established the principle that in America, military power serves civilian authority, never the other way around. The Continental Army that began as a desperate improvisation became the foundation of everything that followed. Every American service member who has ever worn the uniform, from the Marines storming Iwo Jima to the paratroopers jumping into Normandy to the soldiers serving overseas today, traces their lineage back to those farmers and shopkeepers who decided to risk everything for an idea called America. So the next time you see an American flag, remember this: it doesn't just represent a country. It represents the audacious belief that ordinary people can forge themselves into something extraordinary when they unite behind principles greater than themselves. That belief was born in Philadelphia in 1775, tested in the snows of Valley Forge, and proven on the battlefields of a revolution that nobody thought could succeed. The Continental Army didn't just win American independence. It proved that democracy could defend itself through citizen soldiers who chose to serve. And in our world today, as we watch other nations struggle for freedom and self-determination, that lesson remains as vital as ever. Sometimes the most powerful forces in history begin not with overwhelming strength, but with ordinary people finding the courage to become extraordinary.